good afternoon. It's Sunday and welcome back to the shop. So, great progress on the Cobra. Everything is blown off of it. So, anything that is chrome or anything that is attached has been removed. So, the first thing we want to start looking at, again, we talked about this before, it's the mechanics. The brake pedal on this car is bad. I mean, if I go in there and I push the brake pedal, even with my arm and without the engine running, because this has a brake booster, I can push this thing all the way through the travel. So we absolutely have a fluid issue, or there's a fluid leak. This car also has a unique thing that we did about 20 years ago, and that is we have a remote reservoir. So the challenge with these Cobras is that everything is pushed out to the side. So the actual brake master cylinder is underneath this fender, and of course these fenders don't come off. So basically you have to get to them by reaching underneath here. It's very difficult. So what we did at the time is we put in what's these referred to as remote reservoirs. So basically this is attached to the side. I've taken the inspection plate off here to make it easier for me to work on it. But there are two rubber hoses that come out of here. They run around and they go into the back of the master cylinder. The cap that's on the master cylinder is a type where it actually takes two AN fittings and it actually screws in and then locks the cap down. So if I need to add brake fluid, I can do that through these remote cylinders. These are bone dry. In fact, I wish they were bone dry because, to be honest with you, there's some sort of residue in there. Now, I don't know if that's the brake fluid left residue or these weren't clean. I don't know. It is really sticky and gummy. I'm thinking the brake fluid is simply broken down over 20 years. So what we've got is we have no brake fluid in the reservoir. I have no idea if there's any in the hoses. And basically, I can't put fluid in here because it's a mess. I need to take all this apart. So I'm going to take the reservoir off. I'm going to disconnect the hoses. And then here on the master cylinder, I'm going to release the two clips. I'm going to remove the cap, and we're going to take the cap out, and we're going to check the fluid levels and see, are we out of fluid? Is that why the brake pedal is going down? The other thing would be air in the master cylinder, and that means I'm pushing air through, which means I got to bleed the entire system. Let's take a look under this cap and see if we even have brake fluid in this car. What's fun is I'm going to actually be looking at my camera so I can see what I'm doing here. But literally we have to remove that clip and that clip there, and that'll then take this cap off. There's one out of the way. There's two out of the way. So that's what I mean. I had to take the circlip off. Now it just, of course, goes on to the side of the clip, so that'll be easy to put back on. But now let's see what we got here. Okay, so there's the cap off. Let's just put that aside. Good enough. Let's remove the rubber. You can see that there's a hole here because, of course, we're allowing fluid to come in, but it's really wet. I'm kind of thinking that I've got fluid in here, so let me get this out of here. We absolutely have brake fluid in that master cylinder. So we probably need to obviously do a full brake bleed. And it's 20-year-old brake fluid. We're going to fill this thing up. We're going to draw the brake fluid out on all four corners until we get nice clean fluid. And then once we have nice clean fluid, we'll be able to then tackle the fact that the brake pedal still hits the floor. So let's get on to that. Okay, so I've gone around to all four corners, and as we thought, because we still have fluid in the master cylinder, so basically we don't have a leak. Now, we still have a pedal that goes to the ground. Well, we have to look at a few things. Number one is brake fluid is hydroscopic, which means it will absolutely absorb fluid or absorb water. Now, water is not as condensed. You can't compress it like air, but you can still compress it. So we might have a problem with the brake fluid itself. Okay, first thing we do is we have to remove the slide pins. Like I said, lots of pad left on this car, so there's no issues with the pads. Like I said, I'm going to take all these apart. We're going to clean them. We're going to put the lithium brake grease on them, and that way they're not going to squeak. And then, like I said, we're just looking at the seals here now on the master cylinder, or on the piston. They look good. Okay, so before we go on, what have I done? What I've done is I've rechecked and packed the front bearings. So now they've been all tightened back down. We've got a nice feel on the bearing in there. There's no noise. Of course, there's no movement within inside of it. I've also deglazed the rotors, and by deglazing, I just literally took some 80 on a flat block and I just rotated the rotor. Now the pads do not need to be thrown out. These pads are totally fine. They got plenty of stopping distance on them. But I did the same thing. I deglazed these as well. As you can see now, they're back down to a fairly rough surface. This is what the pad should be like. And again, 80 grit on a flat surface. Just rub the shoe back and forth on the flat surface, and that takes off any of the glazing that has happened with the shoe. So really, we're just going to reassemble it. Now remember, when we reassemble, first thing we clean. Next thing we're going to do is use that brake ceramic lubricant. Remember, we don't use grease, we don't use anti-seize. Okay, just before we go, it's all back together. Like I said, we've got the pads are installed properly now. We have a bit of a flex in the line. This is a steel braided line, but I've got a bit of corkscrew in it, and that allows that and the rotor to move back and forth without pinching this line or trapping that line. That's very important. I have put the anti-seize obviously on the inside, on the outside here on the slide points, also on the float pins, right? Because these pins allow this caliper to move back and forth on the brake rotor. Now, this is all assembled. I went inside, pressed the brake a few times, re-engaged this, but look how easy this is to spin, right? And that's how it should be. Those pads are spring-loaded. It's supposed to move the pads away from the rotor until you touch the brake, and then of course then it puts them on. So if it moves this easily in the front, let's see the back. I found the problem with this car sticking when it drives, and it's here. I can barely turn this wheel. What's going on? Well, different cars have different rear brakes. Some of them have drum brakes. Some of them have a hybrid. My Cobra had a hybrid where I had drum brakes on the inside for my emergency brake, but I had a caliper and rotor for when I was using the hydraulic braking system. So I had disc brakes in the back, but my emergency brake was actually a drum. In this case, it's all through the caliper. You step on the brakes, the caliper piston moves in, squeezes the pads, and you bring the vehicle to a stop. In this case, though, when I pull the emergency brake cable, it forces the piston to move in and bring the vehicle to a stop. But just like drum brakes, these auto-adjust over time. With drum brakes, if you drive backwards and apply the brake, it will actually turn a ratchet one click, and that ratchet will eventually open the shoes up in order to compensate for wear over time. Same thing here. Every time you use the emergency brake, it's supposed to not only bring the car to a parking brake, it also ratchets the piston one little bit in order to compensate for the wear of the pads. Here's our problem. We don't use the rears as much as we do the front. So after 20 years, guess what's happened? The rear emergency brake has over tightened or overcompensated for the wear that didn't happen. So what we've got now is we have a situation where these calipers are just literally locked on. The emergency brake inside the cab is all the way down. It's not like I pulled it up. And these things are tight, tight, tight. So what do we got to do? Actually, it's not that bad. Just got to take it apart. I'm going to reset the piston by screwing it back in, right? Because the way these things work, just like the drum brakes that had a ratchet, these have a ratchet as well, and it's a threaded rod that the piston sits on.
And as that threaded rod slowly spins, it moves the piston closer to the pads. We need to reset that. Okay, so as mentioned, I mean, look at the pads. There's a ton of material on these pads. So there's no reason that those pads need to be replaced. But when we take a look at the caliper itself, let's pull this out. We can see that the emergency brake cable is loose, right? There's no pressure on that cable. I can actually move it back and forth. So this is not pulling this down. But look at my piston, how far my piston is out. That is out huge. Now, you'll notice that there's actually indents in the piston. A regular piston, if it doesn't have any indents, means you literally just push it straight back in. In this case, this actually has to be wound in. You got to screw this in order to drive it back into the casing. Now, you can do this a couple of ways. You can actually grab something on here and turn this, but then you might risk hurting the rubber seal that's around it. But that's why they make a tool for this, like this. Now, this is mine that I picked up from Canadian Tire, but basically you can see on the front, you've got these two pins. These pins will actually lock into those two grooves on the piston. Then as I rotate this, which screws in, it will also rotate those pins and spin that piston back in. So we're going to spin the piston back in so it's all the way down. We're then going to put the brakes together. Of course, I'm going to, again, as I said, I'm going to deglaze everything, clean everything up. Now, as I tighten this or turn it, you have to be very aware of one thing. There is a marker on this device that indicates when the pin and the slot are vertical with inside. So I'm stopping right there where this is now indicating that that groove in the piston is straight up and down. And why is that important? Because if we take a look at the brake shoe itself, you'll see there's a raised pin right where my thumb is. That pin has got to engage, when this is put together, that pin has got to engage with that slot. The reason it's got to engage with that slot is because this piston cannot spin. If it spins, then that causes a lot of problems as well. If I do not reset this piston so that this is vertical and it's like horizontal, then this pin will actually sit out here on the side, and then this will rotate. And if this rotates, then it throws everything off. So now by doing this, we are ready to reassemble. So again, I put the lube on everything. We can now insert the pads back in. Both of them have the pins, but always make sure that if one of them doesn't have a pin, that the one that does have a pin is the one that goes, again, where the caliper is, that has that little notch out of it, because that has to engage. If it doesn't engage, then you're in trouble. So again, we got the pads back in. The piston has been recessed. We can now put the piston back onto the cylinder. And there we go. Okay, so let's make sure that rotor is sitting there straight. Of course, this is nice and easy, but let's go put that brake on. You can see that's a lot easier now. I've applied the brake. That is, of course, it's holding a bit, but that's what a rotor and a set of calipers or the caliper is supposed to do. The pads are in contact, but as it's running, this will then free up. And of course, too, also, this is not bolted down. So if this rotor is any out of, because you can see, if the rotor's out, then it's not going to sit smoothly in there. Oh yeah, see, there it goes. So I think we found the problem. So we now put this back together. It's all been cleaned up. I've just got to do the other side, then we can move on to bleeding the brakes and getting all of the fluids changed out of here. Well, I hope that helped those people who've got this style of rear brakes. And again, it only affects this car
because simply the pads aren't wearing down as much as the compensation is occurring. So we've got the fronts all done, they're all ready to go. We got the rears all done, all ready to go. All we want to do now is replace and flush the brake fluid, and I'll show you that in the next video because in all honesty, I'm done for the day. So anyways, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, hit that like button, and I'll see you in the next video.